back to the Stone Age, a frank resumption of Paleolithic life without the spur of Paleolithic hunger. So Mr. Graham Wallas, in his good book on human nature in politics, describes hunting and fishing. He does not mean it as praise. Huntsmen must make their own defence. Fishermen need question only the tone in which the words are used. For the actual words offer a profounder justification of fishing than is offered by most professed apologists. They do not mean a resumption of Stone Age barbarity. Mr. Wallas wrote the words in 1920, when this age of flying machines, big guns, poison gas, cheap newspapers, and other means of creating and justifying hate and panic had only recently given proof of barbarity on such a scale as had never been equalled in the history of man. We have no need to return to the Stone Age to look for barbarity. We have enough and to spare. But it is true that fishing allows us to refresh ourselves by a temporary resumption of a life in which a man's chief concern is not inextricably confounded with other men's activities, but is simply to trick a dinner out of the river. The packet of sandwiches in his pocket, his possible dislike of eating fish, does not affect this matter in the least. Mr. Wallas is right. We have no need for the spur of Paleolithic hunger. Our fishing satisfies quite another need. Escaping to the Stone Age by the morning train from Manchester, the fisherman engages in an activity that allows him to shed the centuries as a dog shakes off water, and to recapture not his own youth merely, but the youth of the world. He may not know that this is his aim. Indeed, if he were too conscious of it, he would not be able to achieve it. But if we watch him, we notice a number of signs that show clearly enough that when he goes fishing, his primary reason is not the need of fish. He imposes on himself unwritten laws that betray his real intention. He has a better reason than hunger for being a fisherman. He is not moved by a primitive instinct for slaughter. If he were, he could satisfy it better by using a hand grenade, poison, or a net. His unwritten laws give the fish approximately the same chance that they had against the hungry savage. Most fishermen are secretly dissatisfied with themselves if they feel that they owe too much of their success to the mechanical perfection of their equipment. For example, I have yet to meet a man who has done much spinning and fly fishing who would not agree at once that he would rather catch his 2-pounder on a fly than with the help of one of the ingenious modern spinning reels. The fisherman sets highest value on those fish which have made the highest demands on his personal prowess, his knowledge of nature, his watercraft, and his skill. A fish caught on a homemade fly is a greater satisfaction to the fisherman than one which has been tricked by a fly bought in a shop. Why? Because it better satisfies the fisherman's instinctive desire to recreate conditions in which he depends on himself alone in his voluntary contest with nature. There is no hostility in this contest. The trout chasing minnows or picking flies from the surface of the stream is contesting with nature in the same way as the fisherman chasing trout. Neither trout nor fisherman are opposed to nature in their several activities, quite the contrary. The homemade fly gives the fisherman a better right to say, "Alone I did it." That is why he prefers it. We should like to make our own rods, our own lines, if we could, but we must make some concessions to our modern inefficiency. We can comfort ourselves with the thought that probably even the Stone Age Halford borrowed his cousin's rod, if it was better than his own, and employed his wife's fingers in plaiting his horsehair line. There may have been no horsehair lines in the Stone Age. There may even have been no rods. No matter. Mr. Wallas slammed the big word Paleolithic at us, not because he had any particular period in mind, but because of the handy weight of its 5 syllables. We return in fishing not to the Stone, but to the Golden Age. Historical accuracy is happily denied to us. We do not feel it necessary to go fishing in a wolf's skin instead of in a Burberry. The character of our return to this mythical age is far deeper than can be expressed by any fancy dress. What we are doing is to exchange an elaborate and indirect for a simple and direct relationship with nature. This latter relationship is very hard to put into words. Is the fisherman returning to the golden age to enjoy aptitudes in himself which he might otherwise lose? Is he reassuring himself by happy experiment that he can still climb down his family tree? Fishing cannot be explained simply as a means of escape from our over-elaborate life, for it is enjoyed by men who have lived all their lives on the river bank, as well as by those who escape to their fishing from the towns. The happiness of Walton's fishing was as keen as our own, but the country was then at a Londoner's back door. The truth, I think, is that we resume Paleolithic life, not because of preference for any past age, but to seek a relationship with nature, which is valuable in all ages. When William Bass wrote, "My hand alone my work can do, so I can fish and study too," he was either a liar or a bad fisherman. For the good fisherman is always engaged in the active exercise of his imagination. He is the fish he catches. He, as that fish, feels the currents in the pool and pushes his way to shelter in a pocket of still water. The fish that go into his creel are so many testimonials to his right reading of nature. The power of vision that he develops while fishing persists when the rod is in its case. The fisherman knows what is happening in the river when he is not there. As the rain pours down on autumn streets, he is conscious, as he buttons his coat about his neck, of the fish running up the Eden from the Solway Firth. The pavements are soft grass under his feet. The stone walls of the houses are no prison for him, and through the roar of the towns he can hear running water. It is this that distinguishes fishing from such pursuits as golf, cricket, football, billiards, or chess. These games do not affect a man's relationship to nature. Fishing does. In looking round for another pursuit of which this can be said, I think of gardening. The gardener, like the fisherman, resumes Paleolithic life without the spur of Paleolithic hunger. Like the fisherman, he becomes so much a part of nature that he is reconciled to the changes of the year. He welcomes the seasons as they come and no longer wishes to put a spoke in the wheel of time. It is generally said that gardeners and fishermen make fine old men. This is not surprising. They have been caught up into nature, grow old with a good will and no hanging back, and are without misgivings about their own mortality. The local angler and the others. A correspondent, in sending me a report on his river, remarks, "River too low for good fishing. Local fishermen have been making big catches." The distinction drawn is most just. Good fishing is an unprofitable business. It is the fishing of the visiting angler. Local fishing, on the other hand, is doing quite nicely, but then it is of a very different kind. In the early months of the season, the distinction is not so marked. The visitor does as well as the local. But now, when the yellow flag irises are blazing by the river, where it runs through the lowland meadows, when the big stones that once made a fine shelter for a trout when the water swept over the top of them are standing high with a ragged fringe of dried moss, when haymaking has begun and cut grass comes drifting down, the conditions for good fishing are poor. Anglers are now divided into local fishermen and those others who toil for nothing through the heat of the day and go home to their evening meals when the local men are thinking of putting their rods together. The local angler is always inclined to look with pity on the visitor, but when the days grow hot and the sea trout begin to run, his pity becomes tinged with scorn. Sea trout are running in plenty up one well-known river, but only an odd one or two have been caught. I asked a local angler why. "Well," said he, "they come from the towns and they hurry down to the river and can't wait till dusk but throw their flies in right away, and by the time they ought to begin they've frightened every fish in the pool. When they have had a fair lot of blanks they stop coming, and then it's time enough for us to start." It is the same thing with the brown trout. The local angler in this weather does not go down to the river till just before sunset. If he does fish the river by day, he passes by all the places where trout would be taking in other circumstances, and goes straight to the places where there is a chance of getting one now. But mostly, If he takes a day's fishing, he leaves the river alone. He watches the visitor wading the main stream, his handsome rod flashing merrily in the powerful sunlight. He says nothing. He has had the best of the season's fly fishing in the river, and now is turning to the becks and minor tributaries, which, happily for him, the visitor disregards altogether. He will apply the same methods in the main river, if there are not too many people trying to do good fishing there. He carries an old, dull rod, with which he can cast a fly if opportunity offers, but stiff enough for a more profitable business. He fishes mostly neither dry fly nor sunk fly, but uses instead the old wet worm, and creeps up the little stream like an Indian, throwing his Stewart or pennel tackle, or single small hook, which is better than the big one of our ancestors, before him into the places in which he caught fish last year, and the year before, and the year before that. The places in which, if he were a trout, he would choose to lie. Sympathetic, intimate imagination, combined with experience, is the whole secret of successful worm fishing. There, under that willow, the bank curves. There, just ahead of that little pillow in the water, must be a pocket big enough for a trout. There, under that overhanging tussock, must be a cool lie. A good trout is always to be found in this gully, where the little water of the stream is given depth in exchange for breadth. At the corner of that stone is the taking place. The worm swings forward and dives without a splash. The line suddenly quivers, and a moment later a fat quarter-pounder is on his way to join his cousins in the basket. And so up the stream. At the mill dam, if a bit of breeze is rippling the surface, the local fisher winds his worm cast round his hat and puts on instead a cast of flies. The mill dam is sometimes good for a brace or two. Then off with the flies, and on with the worm again, sinking it for a moment just above the lip of the dam, where there is always the chance of a big one. After that, up the narrowing beck, now wading ankle-deep between close trees, now wriggling through the bushes on the banks. Sometimes, with a good fish, wishing he had a landing net. Sometimes, when in a thicket of brambles, thanking his stars that he has not. And so up out of the valley to the high moorland, where curlews scream overhead and lapwings noisily mistake the fisherman for an enemy. The young peewits are about just now, and might be mistaken for chickens newly hatched, if it were not that as soon as they begin to run about, they imitate so exactly the characteristic pose of the older birds. At last, high above the valley, with his basket brimming, the local fisherman rests on the heather and looks below him. The little beck that has given him his sport is nowhere to be seen, but far down in the lowland, a broad ribbon of silver shining in the sun, the famous river is dotted here and there with the figures of those who have come from far away to seek good fishing. And with the river at this height, on this day, might almost as well be laying their flies upon a looking-glass.